In mid-December last year, the U.S. hosted the Africa-U.S. Summit, only the second of such. The last was sometime in 2014. And there was no question at all that the summit was meant to at least register America's interest in being a more active player in Africa in response to, the evident dominance of the Chinese. China is Africa's largest bilateral trading partner, and China does about $254 billion in trade in Africa. In 2021, it did about $254 billion in trade. China is also the largest provider of foreign direct investment in Africa, supporting hundreds of thousands of African jobs. Now, this is roughly double the level of U.S. foreign direct investment, and China remains by far the largest lender to African countries. Chinese companies have also taken the lead in exploring minerals in Africa, many now in lithium, mining in Mali, in Guinea, in Nigeria, in DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Zimbabwe, and in Namibia. Most African countries, as you can imagine, are, in my view, rightly unapologetic about their close ties with China. China also shows up when the West will not or is reluctant to show up. And many African countries, of course, are of the view that the warnings about the Chinese Trojan loans may be wise, but are probably self-serving. Africa needs the loans and the infrastructure, and the Chinese offer them. In any case, the history of loans from Western institutions is not great. The memory of the destructive conditionalities of the Bretton Woods loans are still fresh, and the debris is everywhere. And the preoccupation of Western governments and the media with the so-called China debt trap might well be an overreaction. And I would recommend to you a very eye-opening lecture by Professor Deborah Brotigham about 2 weeks ago. She gave the lecture about 2 weeks ago at the Jesus College, Cambridge. The truth, as she points out, is that all of China's lending to Africa is only 5%. And I think she's, roughly accurate there, of all the outstanding public and publicly guaranteed debt in low and middle income countries, compared to 23% held by the World Bank and other multilaterals. Chinese lenders account for just 12% of Africa's private and public external debt. And the Chinese, as I've said, have always been there when the debt even cannot be paid. In early 2020, as COVID battered African economies and, of course, economies worldwide, China came together with other G20 members to launch the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, as it was called. 73 low-income countries benefited from the suspension of principal and interest payments through the DSSI. Chinese banks provided 63% of the total debt relief, while it only owed 30% of the debt service payments that were due. So, by and large, in the arguments about Chinese, how, the Chinese debt trap, as sometimes called, and the large amounts of loans to African countries, etc., I think that what is clear is that the Chinese have proved to be, by and large, quite responsible in their approach to the giving of these loans. Of course, there are always arguments about whether or not you get the very best deal all the time. The history of loans from Western institutions is not great. The memory of the destructive conditionalities of the Bretton Woods loans are still fresh, and the debris is everywhere. Most African countries, as you can imagine, are, in my view, rightly unapologetic about their close ties with China. Africa needs the loans and the infrastructure, and the Chinese offer them. In any case, the history of loans from Western institutions is not great.